Well, good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we continue in our study of the book of Daniel in the Unfolding the Word ministry. We're in the midst of a study of the final portion of the book of Daniel, the final vision, starting in chapter 10, working through to the first part of chapter 12. Today, I want to pick up verses that we've started to look at already related to details about the period of Antiochus Epiphanes and the disaster he brought upon the Jewish people. I'm going to pick up our reading today in verse 29 of chapter 11. At that appointed time he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For the ships of Kittim, by the way, that's Roman ships, shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the burnt offerings. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate, and he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and shall take action. We've been looking at these details in this final vision, the most extended of the visions, as it relates to the unfolding plan of God for history and for his people, the Jews. He's given us other prophecies in this book of Daniel. These points in the final prophecy amplify, build some more flesh on the bones of God's clear picture of his mastery and control of history as it unfolds. The first stop in our details had to do with the Persian Empire, from Daniel's time until the coming of Alexander. The second stop, more details about Alexander's empire, his death, the breaking of it into four parts. The third stop, two of the parts of the former Greek Empire, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, continue a struggle for 200 years to gain control over the Holy Land. The fourth stop we've been looking at now for a couple of days had to do with one of the Seleucid rulers, a ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes, whose reign proved to be a disaster for the Jewish people, a disaster God foretold them about. We saw a part of that disaster emerged as he lost face in an attempt to defeat the Ptolemaic Empire in alliance with the Roman Empire. He had to back down and come back, and as he backs down, he hears of a rebellion among the Jews within Judea, which was under his leadership. And so he moves forward at that point, having already had a troubling history with the Jews and their stubbornness. And now that sets the stage for the disaster under his leadership. And that's where we are today and in the verses I read to you. As Antiochus Epiphanes is retreating with his full army from Egypt, losing face before the peoples and losing face certainly before Rome, he hears the news of the Jews revolting against his rule. This troublesome people. We talked about some of that process over time yesterday. And so he's determined now as he turns his army to the Holy Land to say, I will break these people at all cost. I will root out the rebelliousness of these Jews once and for all. And so in 167 BC, he brings the full weight of his armed forces and power against the Holy Land. And he attacks Judea and especially its capital, Jerusalem, without mercy. As I said yesterday, he had his whole army with him, more than he would have needed to defeat the Jews. But they were with him, having just come back from not engaging the enemy in Egypt and itching for a fight, really. And so he unleashes them against Judea and Jerusalem and very quickly defeats Jason. We talked about Jason yesterday. He was the leader of the rebels, very quickly defeats him and his supporters. And as he defeats him, he then determines to brutalize Jerusalem and the Jews, to make it a byword among the people, to make what happened in the Jews so devastating that no other parts of his empire would dare to rule, to break and rebel against his autocratic rule. Particularly the verses that I read to you says he will cause fearful destruction and destroy many. Now, give you the flavor of the scope of the disaster that came upon the Jews at this point in time. First of all, there were many, many Jews killed in the battles initially as the armies descended on Jerusalem, on Judea, and as they were resisted, there was a tremendous casualty outcome among the armies, but not just the armies, the Jewish people in general. After Jerusalem fell, and Antiochus Epiphanes was clearly in control, he then took 40,000, according to the historians, took 40,000 men, women, and children out of Jerusalem who had survived the siege and the war and kills them. Massacres 40,000 more on top of all of the people who had been killed. And then he takes another 40,000 and sends them off into slavery. So on top of all of the other casualties, he reduces the Jewish people now through death and slavery by another 80,000 people. I submit to you that would have been a disaster of unknown proportion for the Jewish people as they reflected upon it. And you'd think, well, did he get his anger out of his system? Did that solve the problem? And according to the historians and according to the prophecy here in Daniel chapter 11, the answer is no, that didn't get it out of his system. Antiochus Epiphanes was determined not just by the bloodshed directed toward the Jews, but by an aggressive action toward the center of Jewish nationalism, which was the temple, the Jewish faith. He was going to destroy that center. And so he went about profaning the Jewish temple. He wanted to humiliate the Jews' God once and for all. He didn't believe the Jews' God was real. And he wanted to humiliate the concept of that God being there once and for all. And the best way to do that was to go to supposedly the center of his power in this world and do terrible things to it. The temple was obviously key to the Jewish people and to their worship of God. And so the first thing he does is he goes in and robs the temple of anything of value in it, gets rid of all of that. Secondly, he then, among the Jews in Jerusalem and throughout Judea, forbids them to practice any sacrifice or service in the temple for at least 3 years. They were carrying out daily sacrifices. No sacrifices for sin, nothing. The temple cannot be used for that. And by the way, it had a death penalty connected to it. So if anyone was caught doing it, they would be killed. It was a capital punishment if they did that. Then, that wasn't enough. He'd already decimated, in human terms, the temple, but he erected a statue of the Greek god Zeus in the temple, the very place given over to the worship of God. He then shows the Jewish head god as really the god, and so a temple of Zeus is put up in the holy place of the temple. More, he said, I don't want anybody even trying to use these altars anymore, so he sacrifices a pig on the altars in the temple. And of course, that in Jewish law defiled the temple, so they couldn't be used without cleansing for continued sacrifices. A disastrous action, which led to a lot more bloodshed against the religious center of the Jewish people. Certainly, many at that time would have thought, where is our God? Maybe we've been trusting in a false God all along. Wouldn't he have intervened and prevented us from being defeated? And certainly, wouldn't he have intervened and prevented his temple from being desecrated in this way? They were real people. They had to be faced with those kinds of questions and doubts. And many at that time among the Jews, in the face of that reality, turned their back on a wholehearted Jewish faith and turned their back on God and bought into Antiochus Epiphanes' worldview, which was that Greek worldview, that humanistic worldview, the false teaching and apostasy that was part of that. And by the way, the Hellenized Jews, which were the group that did that, continued to exist 200 years later, many Hellenized Jews still existed within Palestine at the time of Jesus. They represented a segment of the Jewish community. Well, many compromised, but the verses I read to you said, not all did. But the people, in verse 32, but the people who know their God shall stand firm. Not all gave in the face of not even having answers for the questions. They knew God had reasons, and they trusted in their God, a faithful remnant. They refused to accept what was happening and did not give in to the attempt to cancel out the faith in God. Isn't that a wonderful picture? Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to look at this and see the final things that God tells us here about that period of Antiochus Epiphanes. After we do that, he will move our attention toward the end of history in the time of the Antichrist. Join me then, won't you? God bless.